issues that we get of degradation and loss of biodiversity and leading to pollution of our health and our planet. So in today's webinar, I invite you all to participate and interact with the resource experts here today to educate us and share the experience and case studies from Uganda and other member states in Africa and to the rest of the globe. So thank you all for joining and getting interested in this very important webinar for advancing NCA in Africa. I am sure that the outcomes of these discussions and deliberations will advance our NCA work across Africa. So let us all interactively have a productive webinar. And with that, we want to focus on the main content of the day. So allow me to thank the presenters team and our own partner institution, CSF, that is behind this work and contributing to advance NCA in Africa under the Africa NCA Community of Practice. Allow me now to invite our chair and moderator for this session, Mr. Mark Gerrard, who is the director from Conservation Strategy Fund, to set the scene and invite other speakers. Over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Super. Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Super, thank you. Yeah, good afternoon and welcome everybody. And I know we've got people joining us across time zones here. So good morning and evening for those joining from different parts of the world. And thank you very much, Peter, for this very warm welcome. And of course, to the NCA Community of Practice for hosting us today. I'm very excited about today's webinar because it's an opportunity to take a look at the next step in terms of decision making from a perspective of building onto natural capital accounting. As mentioned by Peter, my name is Mark Gerrard. I am the Africa Director for Conservation Strategy Fund. I'm based in Durban in South Africa. I am under load shedding at the moment, so no electricity, so I hope the battery's lost, but it should be good. My work does extend, and our work extends much more broadly than just South Africa, and we're working across the region, Eastern and Southern Africa, and more broadly than that. So personally, I focused much of my professional career exploring methods to fund expansion of conservation areas and really trying to look at the unique value of Africa's biodiversity and landscapes as a means to generate economic activity. Specifically for rural areas, trying to drive economic development in rural areas and really ensuring that the relevance of wildlife to adjacent communities is there, and then making an economic case for when engaging with other commercial interests. Just in terms of the Conservation Strategy Fund itself, maybe just to give you a brief overview. As we all know, human activities can have devastating consequences on natural environment, and that impacts our own health and well-being. But it's through human activities that we can also explore ways to conserve and restore our natural ecosystems. And so by using economics to quantify the social, environmental impacts of human activities, we hope to make smarter development decisions around the world. And that's what CSF does, Conservation Strategy Fund does. We use economics to determine the value of nature and the socioeconomic impact of development activities to conserve nature and biodiversity, and with the aim of improving human well-being. And really, if we can incentivize investment into natural systems, that's a large part of our goal. So we are a global organization, we're a conservation NGO, and we provide economic analysis, tools, and capacity building for a number of stakeholders on some of the global sort of world's most pressing environmental issues. We work across a broad spectrum of stakeholders, from government, conservation NGOs, donors, and then also with people working that are stewards on the land, so farmers, fishermen, and others working on the ground. And really what we're aiming to do is to raise economic literacy worldwide, and create a better understanding of how economics can improve decision-making that impacts nature and people. So today we are joined by colleagues from a variety of backgrounds, very, very privileged to have Prof. David Johnson with us today, and Kim Bonan, who works with us in Conservation Strategy Fund. We are still waiting for Ronald Kagwa to join us from Uganda, so hopefully he'll be with us soon. So maybe just to dive straight into it. So David Johnson, he's currently a senior lecturer in the Department of Economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is in South Africa at the moment, and he's been here for the last year, which has been really great. Prior to Wisconsin, he taught microeconomics, macroeconomics, development economics, and environmental economics at Wellesley College, Harvard University, Stanford University, and the Duke University. So really sort of has a huge amount of experience behind him, and sort of has wide recognition for his teaching talent. And I think what I always love about David is he makes the topic so interesting and so relevant and so important. And so really excited to get David's input and insight into things at this stage. And so today, David's going to talk about integrating natural capital into national development policies, gaining insights from environmental economics, market failures, and incentives. So with that, David, I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Mark, for that tremendous introduction. Welcome, everyone. I'm an economist, so I'll just pause so people can go make a sandwich or do something else. And no, that's generally when people decide to do something else. My big role in all of this, both as an economist and as a consultant for CSF, is to make these topics relevant and powerful by taking a lot of the jargon out of it. So even using the phrase natural capital accounting seems like it's jargon upon jargon upon jargon. So what I'm going to do briefly is I'm going to take a few steps back, give you what I think is a nice introduction to what we mean by capital generally, what we mean by accounting generally, and start with an example that seems a little out there, but it's one we can all relate to. And then I will go to more environmental examples, and then turn it over to Kim and Ronald, who will give you really nuts and bolts examples of how these techniques, of how the concepts, of how the theories are being applied in meaningful and consequential ways. So with that as a backdrop, if I were to ask you what I meant by a factor of production, right? So let's start with the jargon. A factor of production is nothing more than one thing that's used to make something else. And if you've ever had a course in economics that you survived, you probably learned that the factors of production in the macroeconomy are land, labor, capital, raw materials, and they always threw in entrepreneurship, which I really have no idea what that means, but the first four make sense to me. So already, if I'm using land, labor, capital, and raw materials to produce something, those are considered my factors of production. What's more, the second of those, land, is absolutely a part of a country's natural capital. So already, even in that first course in economics, you've been learning about natural capital, even though nobody called it that. So natural capital, excellent definition, the stock of a country's natural assets. It needs no more complicated than that. So the question now becomes, if I have land, labor, capital, raw materials, how do I account for those in the production of goods and services? So I'm going to give, as I said, a kind of a basic example of what we're doing now and ask you what factors of production are going into this webinar from me. Well, first of all, there's my labor. I'm here, hi, I'm waving to you, I'm using my voice to talk to you. That labor is an absolutely important and critical factor of production in producing this webinar. But I would argue it's not, by far and away, not the most important factor of production. It's what's here. And what's here inside my cranium is my human capital. So my human capital are the knowledge and skills that enable me to basically, hopefully, teach you about some basics of environmental economics. Now, what distinguishes labor from capital is that labor needs to be reproduced every day. If we did this webinar tomorrow, I would have to show up tomorrow. But the human capital that's here is what we would call a non-exhaustible factor of production. There we go. Go make another sandwich. Yes, more jargon, but it's still here tomorrow, right? Unless the dementia kicks in, and more on that later. Unless my human capital depreciates, it will still be here tomorrow. It's not going to be exhausted today. So if I were to ask you how it is that I got my job at Wisconsin, you would probably say it's less to do with the fact that I can use my hands and my voice. It certainly isn't my looks or my boyish charm. It's what's between my temples. It's my human capital. I got my job teaching economics at Wisconsin because I demonstrated to my department chair that I had the capacity to produce lectures to 200 and 300 people every semester in micro and macroeconomics. Now, let's go to the accounting part. How did I account for that human capital? How did I show my employer that I actually have quite a buoyant amount of this human capital? It's called my CV, correct? I gave them my CV, and on my CV, it listed all of my qualifications, typically my degrees, my education, as an accounting of my human capital. Now, does that human capital depreciate? I know this is not what you came to hear about, but what I'm going to try and do is synthesize all of these concepts with the natural world. I think you actually know more about natural capital accounting than you think you do at this point. So, does my human capital depreciate? Yes, in a number of ways. I'm getting older. I'm getting forgetful. That's a certain type of human capital depreciation. But also, I make sure that my human capital keeps current. I learn about new theories in economics. I'm up on the literature, all that good stuff. Do I think that my human capital now is just as buoyant as it was when I first got that job? Yes, I think it is. And it's been demonstrated that I continue to be able to produce productive lectures for my students. Let's suppose I were looking for a job in tech. If I were looking for a job in tech and my CV, I graduated from college in 1985. If you weren't born yet, please don't tell me. But if I had that degree in 1985 in computer science, do you think that has very high human capital market value in today's economy? Probably not. So those skills that I had in 1985, potentially as a computer scientist, have largely depreciated, have gone down in value. So those accounting principles for that human capital are very well established. All of you likely used a CV to get your job where you dictated or you delineated all of that human capital. But now let's go to more natural capital extensions. So I'm arguing that if you understand capital as a broad concept, as a factor of production that's non-exhaustible, if you can account for that capital, then you can place a value on it, and that value also comes into the market decision. I'm in the labor market. That market value is in that CV due to that human capital. So let's segue from that into more agricultural, or more, I should say, environmental examples. So land, a fantastically important piece of natural capital. If you're in agriculture, have you accounted in your agricultural plot for the value that that natural capital is producing as a factor of production? You clearly have. You know the quality of your soil. You've used irrigation techniques to do what? To keep a buoyant amount of water, another enormously important piece of natural capital coming to your plot. You also have used fallow techniques and other things, rotating crops, all of that good stuff. So agriculture is one of those things where we've been accounting for natural capital and the ecosystem services that it provides for generations. Again, arguing that you know exactly how to do this. What we're not doing is we're not applying it more broadly. We're not applying it to major infrastructure projects or to other land uses that are now coming into play. Another good example of a technique that Kim and Ronald will talk to you about. One of the main threats to agriculture in my home state of Wisconsin, where it's very, very important, is the drop in pollinators. Specifically, bee pollinators have dropped because of habitat loss, because of nasty killer bees coming from outside our country, and all other sorts of reasons. So now what a lot of people in my state do is they actually rent bees. They call up Billy the bee guy, and he brings his bees to help pollinate the crop. Now, was that an ecosystem service that was being produced when those pollinators were buoyant in terms of their populations? Yes. Was that value something that those agricultural people 50 years ago were benefiting from? Yes. How do we value those pollinators? Well, now, because there are dramatically less of them, we use what economists would call replacement cost. So what I, as a farmer in Wisconsin, am paying to Billy the bee guy is something I used to get for nothing. But that value, that replacement cost, is most assuredly going into the market value of my crop because it is now an explicit cost of production. But understand that it was a value, an ecosystem service, something that my natural capital in Wisconsin used to provide in a buoyant way that was important to me as an agriculturalist. Let's think of another example. A lot of cities in my country are going to electronic vehicles. If I hear read one more story about the move to EV, right? It's all over the news, certainly in the United States. And if we're moving to, in a city like Madison or Milwaukee or even New York City, going to electric buses, one of the calculations that they're putting in to the costs and benefits of that move are the benefits to air and water quality of moving from fossil fuel-based buses to electronic vehicle buses. And guess what? The valuation that they're putting on those benefits is another excellent example of natural capital accounting. So how am I going to basically understand how valuable cleaner air and cleaner water are in a major US city? I can certainly look at what the costs have been of using those fossil fuel-based buses. Drops in air quality, increased healthcare costs because of the drop in air quality, people missing work and loss of productivity. All of those represent valuations that I can put a monetary value on and put into the calculation of why that's a good reason for me to use or to move to electronic buses. So that becomes part of the calculus, if you will. It becomes part of that cost-benefit analysis that is causing major cities to move into electronic vehicles. So we've already done examples of this. We're using examples of this as we move on. So the final point that I wanted to make, just in terms of how we go from accounting for human capital to accounting for natural capital, is to understand what market failure we're talking about. I would argue with you, or I would try to cajole you into thinking that environmental damage and the destruction of the planet is absolutely a market failure. We have for years and arguably centuries been benefiting from the natural world being the classic public good. I could use its services without paying for them, and my use of those environmental services in no way impinged upon your ability to use them. So in the jargon of economics, a public good has low excludability. I don't have to pay to use it. It also has low rivalry. My using it doesn't affect your ability to use it. Both of those have been threatened by climate change. So the market failure for us as environmental economists is that the environment, nature itself, is no longer that pure public good. Arguably, it's a common resource tragedy, or it's basically being destroyed because of what economists would call the free rider problem. We're not charging people for the true value of what they're using from the natural world. So that market failure, the public good problem now with the environment, is largely due to the property rights for those natural capital assets not being properly defined and well protected. So ask anyone in your country who owns that country's natural capital, and the answer will be everyone. It belongs, nature belongs to all of us. Totally right. Now ask everyone in your country who should be responsible for sustaining that natural capital and its ecosystem services. And the answer is not me, my neighbor. So we all collectively own that natural capital, but when it comes to sustainability, we're quite happy to free ride off of our neighbor or off of somewhere else. So someone else, I should say. So in terms of that market failure, I would also suggest to you that it is not so much a market failure, even though it is, but it is a case of missing markets. We have been relying on the market value or on the ecosystem service value of nature for centuries without actually bringing them into the market mechanism themselves. So with the bee pollinator or with electronic vehicles or with your major infrastructure projects, we now have a way, replacement cost, hedonic pricing, other things that Kim and Ronald, techniques they're going to talk to you about. We have a beautiful way of placing an economic value on nature. And the reason I put it that way is you're going to get major pushback from the general public when you start using phrases like that. Well, nature is way too valuable to put a dollar value on it. Okay, so then why is it being destroyed? If it's so valuable, why aren't we paying more to protect it? And the answer is because those missing markets, we've not put those environmental and ecosystem services into the market decision-making mechanism. And because we haven't done that, no one has been properly disincentivized or incentivized. If we go to renewable energy, everybody will tell you we need to make renewable energy more a part of what we're doing. So maybe we should subsidize renewable energy. That would use the market mechanism to get more of what we want in terms of pollution and its externalities in terms of air and water quality. If we want less pollution, maybe we should start charging people for that pollution, and therefore they would start polluting less. So I think that missing market concept is extremely important. Back in the day, 50, 100 years ago, those needn't have been marketable assets or marketable services because they were around in quite buoyant levels. That is no longer true. I would argue also with you that we use the three R's we generally use are reduce, reuse, and recycle. The first one we almost automatically ignore. Reduce. We ignore that one. Oh, I'm reusing. Great. I'm recycling. Yeah, but could you reduce? That's why that's the first R. So what we do, certainly in the economics profession and also at CSF, it's a lovely, I've been working with them for over 20 years. It's a fantastic organization, is that we actually make the tough calls. We bring environmentalists in the room and talk to them about economics. When most environmentalists think that economics is the problem. You are correct. Economics and market failure is the problem. But the solution to that problem is also those market mechanisms that have been missing, that have been absent from most of what's happening in the natural world. Now we have the techniques to do that natural capital accounting. And that, I should now turn it back to Mark. That's where Kim and Ronald come in and talk to you about how these techniques are being applied to major infrastructure projects and why that's so important. Thank you for your time.
David, thank you very, very much. Yeah, always good to sort of really understand where this is all coming from and where it started. And there's no doubt going to be questions, but I'm going to ask if everyone can just hold their questions till the end. And then we can go into a question and answer session at the end, and maybe there's some specific points that people want to raise there, David. But thanks again. So I think Ronald is still having some technical difficulties in getting through to us. So we'll persevere with that. And in the meantime, I'm gonna hand over to Kim. Kim Bonan is a colleague of mine in the Conservation Strategy Fund. And Kim has been involved in not just in CSF, but in this topic and in these discussions for many years, and just brings such a wealth of experience into this space. She leads our Numbers for Nature Training Institute, and as well as our Economics for Environmental Leadership training program. She's got experience across 40 countries and 5 continents. And over the last 20 years, she has led design and implementation of environmental economics courses and analysis projects in Africa, Asia, North and South America on themes such as wildlife conservation, infrastructure development, fisheries management, tourism economics, and sustainable livelihoods. And so this is really a great opportunity for us to explore specific case studies and to start really understanding those mechanisms that David spoke about and to start understanding the applications. So I think, Kim, so part of the value in being in this community of practice and having the discussions with countries that are really starting to adopt and implement NCA as part of their statistical and planning processes. A lot of the questions and comments or sort of thinking now is, how do we use this framework to assist us in decision making? How do we take that next step towards sort of improving policies or changing policies, helping us to sort of move to a place where we can have a much more efficient use of resources at country level. So maybe with that, I'll hand over to you, and yeah, we can have discussions afterwards. Thanks, Kim.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Mark. Can you hear me all right?
Perfectly, yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks everyone for joining us. I've been scrolling through the attendees list. It's really nice to see some familiar names, some folks who I've had the pleasure of meeting through some of our training programs and our analysis work. And thanks, David, for that great introduction and setting the scene. And hopefully Ronald will be able to join us. We collaborated with Ronald a number of years ago, and I'll actually be presenting about a project we worked on while we were working with him while he was at NEMA in Uganda, and he has lots of insights to share. So fingers crossed that he's able to solve his technical difficulties and join us. So what I'm going to do is share a few examples and also sort of a perspective of how do we connect these natural capital accounting initiatives and data and information and processes to trying to answer questions and to inform decision making, to try and help inform policy decisions, project decisions. So I'm going to share a presentation. I have some slides I'm going to go through, and then I'm really looking forward to hearing questions and comments. There's so many examples that I would love to share, but I picked two that I thought might be most illustrative of trying to make kind of that connection to natural capital accounts and the CF framework, that sort of thing, and decision making. So I'm going to share my screen here. And we'll start the slideshow. Is that working? Can you all see it?
That's working well, thank you.
Working well. Okay, great, great. So the title of this webinar is Integrating the Value of Natural Capital into Policy and Investment Decisions for Economic Development. And there's a number of ways that can be done. We could probably spend an entire week. This maybe should be a week-long webinar. There's so many things we could discuss. David alluded to a number of different ways we can try to integrate considerations about the environment into our decisions, into our incentive decisions. And one of the ways is sometimes at a project level where there's a decision being made, and the opportunity that's really exciting about this kind of nationwide integration of the environment and natural capital into these accounts is it provides an opportunity to broaden this and really scale it to a country level and really integrate it into what's being counted when we talk about a country's growth or a country's well-being. And it's a new way and a broad way. And so I'm going to share some connections of how those kind of statistical processes could try to inform decisions and projects kind of on the ground. All right. I wanted to recognize that some of these examples I'm going to share, we put together some of these case studies as part of a really wonderful program that I was involved in. And I think I see Peter Sharon was one of the attendees. He was one of the main people involved a program around mainstreaming natural capital and African development finance. And we worked with a number of institutions to put together a natural capital academy, put together some training, capacity building, resources, pull some case studies. So I'm going to be sharing some of those pieces that we put together for that initiative. And I know later in the webinar, hopefully we're going to get to talking a bit more about capacity building, which is a huge part of this whole community of practice. How do we share knowledge, and how do we build these human capital resources, and also kind of institutional capacity, as David was talking about. As part of that project, for example, we ran a training workshop in December in Nairobi, and we brought together staff from various national development finance institutions. And we have a training program we've been putting together that we are hoping will be launched soon, and make this course available to others. And it will include things like David mentioned about how do we talk about some of the methods, like valuation methods that are being used to inform these natural capital accounts. How do we think about cost benefit analysis? How do we integrate that into project and policy decisions? So I think the question here that I'm hoping to try and address in this presentation is around, okay, so we have our natural capital accounts, and there have just been, it's phenomenal what so many countries in Africa are doing right now. There's been so much development and progress in these natural capital accounts. And every time I go to the WAVE site or another site, I see another country's accounts, and it's really exciting. But how do we, now what do we do? How do we connect that to some of these decisions, these things that are happening, sometimes with a very, sometimes urgency of making decisions? So something that I just want to reflect, and many of you who are working in natural capital accounting might be very familiar with kind of these four main parts. We have this biophysical piece where we're really trying to understand the extent of different ecosystems. It's all very spatial. Where's our area that we're talking about? What's the extent? What's the condition of those ecosystems? Really trying to have that biophysical measurement and monitoring. And then what are the flow of services going to people? So we have these ecosystems, we have these ecosystem services, they're providing benefits to people that affect their well-being. And we can, in some cases, not all cases, we can try to measure that well-being in terms, in monetary terms. And as David was mentioning, this is the point often where we can incorporate some of those values and the change in those values. So if we have these accounts and we already have a connection of the extent of an ecosystem with the value of the services it's providing, it really gives us a head start in then trying to integrate that into a decision that might affect that stock of natural capital, that might affect that flow of ecosystem services. So integration into the decision-making process. I'm just going to mention a few things, and then I'm going to share just a couple case studies that are examples of some tools that are typically used to inform decision-making. So ecosystem accounting framework, again, it depends on the scale. So this can be at a national scale, a subnational scale. You can do accounts at local levels. It really helps assess risks and opportunities, even without the monetary values. You can look at changes. You can look at impacts on sensitive areas. You can compare options. You can look at impacts on different stakeholders. And you can also try and look at value. You can either qualitative or quantitative or monetary. And it really helps as a communication tool. And something else that I want to mention, and I really appreciate it, I was going back through a number of the webinars of this community of practice and looking at some of the things that have been discussed in the past. And I think it was back in October of 2020, and there was a nice presentation about policy scenario analysis. And that's still on the website if you want to go in and look at a really nice in-depth presentation. And one of the points made that I think is really important is this idea of data push versus data pull. And so we've been in this line of work for 25 years now, and often being asked to analyze the impacts of a decision or policy or project. And so oftentimes we are in the position of trying to pull data from somewhere or do on the ground primary research to figure out what are the impacts going to be on these ecosystems, modeling those ecosystems or that habitat, looking at deforestation, trying to figure out what the values of those things are and how that will change. And that's really trying to pull the data or using something like the TEEB database, trying to do a benefit transfer. There's all different ways. And the idea of having in place these natural capital accounts where you have data that are there and information that you can push and that's available and you're pushing into the processes, it's really exciting, rather than having to try to do this and get the data every time you are trying to assess a project. And so some tools to integrate this type of information and data coming from these accounts into decision-making, scenario modeling is one that is, again, very visual and spatial, very helpful to use mapping and layers and see what the changes are going to be. Another is feasibility and cost benefit analysis. And this is important because this is typically the primary tool used by governments, for example, to make decisions about projects and feasibility of projects. So it's really important to know how to integrate these values and the changes in natural capital into these decisions. And then another one that I'm not going to give an example about in this webinar, but economic impact analysis is another tool that's very useful. And that has more to do with not the net benefits, not comparing benefits and costs, but it's taking the benefits, more the gross revenues, and asking, well, where are they going? How long are they circulating in an economy? How many jobs are they creating? What about tax revenue? That sort of thing. And so integrating into decision-making economic impact analysis, this accounting can also really help inform that type of analysis. So I'm going to go through just a few case studies in the time that we have. And I don't know, Mark, you can also jump in and let me know if Ronald has been able to join us. Otherwise, I can keep going longer. Just let me know.
That's fine, Kim. Yeah, maybe just start with these case studies and then we'll see where we get.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to mention a few things about scenario modeling, and it's really exciting, at least in the time I've been in this field over the past 20, 25 years with CSF, seeing how much information we now have that we can put into these different layers, into mapping. Here's an example from a paper that came out just a couple years ago, really being able to look at these changes in habitat, changes in natural capital, and the values of that, and then being able to look at what the monetary impact of that over time. And as just a caveat, and we could do a whole other webinar about valuation, that actually might be really interesting. Economic valuation is necessarily only going to capture part of the value. There's so many different ways that we value things. And so this is only a piece of it. But also, as David was saying, it's better than zero. If we're starting with zero, anywhere we're going from there is good in terms of how it's being incorporated into decisions. Another example, this is just to show some visuals of how this can be useful. This is a paper by some folks from the Natural Capital Project, looking, helping inform decision-making around coastal management in Belize, for example. And it really helps you map different scenarios. And if you have this information about the costs and the values, it really helps you understand not only what the changes are going to be, but how the values will be affected and what might be the best management path forward. And I'm going to share an example that for the scenario modeling, I'm going to share a project that we worked on a number of years ago. And I think it's a nice example because we didn't have the benefit of these natural capital accounts. And I think that would have that sort of accounting and information would have been very helpful. So this was a study that we did in 2015 looking at pipeline routing. You know, how do you try to map and model and make decisions about routing? And this was in collaboration with NEMA, with the Uganda Wildlife Authority, with WCS, as a follow-up to a training course that we did in Uganda. And we had a whole team of people, a really wonderful group that I just wanted to recognize here from kind of all over, working on this, and really trying to work on the modeling and the spatial analysis piece. The methodology, I'm just going to briefly say, it was really trying to identify these financial and environmental variables and creating these maps with the variables and identifying potential routes, and then trying to look at the difference in terms of the overall cost and also kind of the value and how that change in value will happen. And I just want to draw your attention to number 4. We had to pull from the TEEB database and a benefit transfer method to try to estimate the economic values of the environmental impacts. And so if these accounts had been in place that were a spatial extent that would be relevant, that would have really helped in this sort of project, that we would have been able to pull some of those in. The results of this, we used MarkSan, and that's another tool often that can be used to prioritize and for spatial planning. And what we tried to do, and this might look sort of familiar, it's almost like some of the things one does with natural capital accounts, of trying to look at the size of the area affected, what's the value of the ecosystem services, what might that change in value be, what is the least cost path when you put all of those things together. And so we looked at a financial path and we looked at an environmental path. Picture here. So here, this route, for example, is purely minimizing financial costs. And then on the right-hand side, this is where we were able to add those other layers and those other considerations of cost and look at a routing that optimized and kind of minimized all of those costs together. So this is the type of modeling that is very helpful to inform decision-making, because it gives you a fuller accounting of all the trade-offs. What are you actually giving up and what are you actually getting? And I think that's really what we're trying to do in decision-making, and what natural capital accounting is trying to help us better understand and account for, is what are we actually giving up for the things that we're getting? And before, sometimes all we were getting information or data about was what we were getting, not what we're giving up in terms of, for example, some infrastructure projects. So cost benefit analysis is another important tool to inform decision-making. And it's really, again, it's really about those trade-offs. What are all the benefits you're getting over time? And what are all the costs over time? And you put all those together and you compare them, and you try to answer the question, is this worth it? Are we getting more benefits than costs at the end of the day? And oftentimes the environment and the cost of impacts, or the benefits of a improvement in the environment don't even get a line on the spreadsheet. So we're trying to change that. So this was a case study that we shared as part of our Natural Capital Academy training that I mentioned. This is a recent report from the NCAVES project. So I think it's a useful one to share. And this was connecting natural capital accounts with trying to evaluate the costs and benefits of addressing land degradation in the KwaZulu-Natal area in South Africa. And I also want to thank our other collaborator on the project, Dr. Lydia Chikumbi, who helped put together this presentation. So the objective of this study was to try to look at the return on investment, essentially, of reducing land degradation, investing in restoration by 2030. So looking out over time. So there's a business as usual scenario. There is a scenario of meeting land degradation neutrality, LDN, or there's also a scenario of, well, what if we went further? What if we did further restoration? At the end of the day, what would the net benefits be? And so this is the catchment area here, and it's quite large. It's, let's see, it's 2.91 million hectares and occupies about a third of the province. And it's estimated that almost a third, well, a quarter, I guess, just over a quarter of this land was degraded as of the base year. And various human activities had adverse effect, had been affecting the services from this catchment area. And I have a list of them here. So those include things like overgrazing, bush encroachment, spread of invasive species, cultivation, mining, and a lot of the grasslands and savannas were severely affected. So these are some of the pressures, these are some of the threats to this area. And in this analysis, and to kind of link it to some of the assets and stocks, looking at water retention and water supply, looking at erosion control, connecting it to sediment retention, soils, carbon sequestration, and then also the provisioning of these kind of direct benefits from these areas, livestock products, wood products, non-wood products, and then also tourism, nature-based tourism. And this is often something in the years of our work that some of the impacts on tourism for example, you can get some ready market values on that. And so sometimes that's one of the things that is one of the low-hanging fruit that sometimes you can put into an analysis. So the study had, as I mentioned, a business as usual scenario, kind of low intervention, continued degradation, and then two other scenarios, the land degradation neutrality scenario, and then full restoration. And the idea was to look at the change in the biophysical supply. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, and we can share the link. You're welcome to read the full paper. But the idea is being able to look and model the change in the biophysical supply, and then how that will change the value of the provision of those services over time. And then that then can be integrated and incorporated into a cost-benefit analysis, and looking at the upper and lower bound estimates for cost, as well as a full restoration scenario. And then you get, at the end of the day, this net present value that's trying to compare all of those things in present terms. Are the benefits greater than the costs? And so you can see that they are, with the lower bound costs of the land degradation neutrality scenario, but very, very high with the full restoration scenario, which is interesting. And I think an important finding of the study. So first conclusion is that halting and reversing this degradation has positive net economic benefits. And for full restoration, each rand invested has a return of at least 1.7 rand. So the return on investment is very high. And it'd be interesting to look at how long does it take to get that return, and the difference between the financial outlay, the economic returns, and who's getting the benefits, who's bearing the costs. That's really, really important for all of this. But this case demonstrates an application of ecosystem accounting for policymaking. And so I want to just share some final thoughts that I think are really important to put some of these considerations into kind of a larger context when we think about development and decision making. And so three points that I wanted to mention. The first is, as all of you know and involved in this effort to count things better. So what counts and when is it counted? And I think there's a great quote, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that's counted counts. And it really matters. And when things are counted matters. And being able to do this at a larger landscape scale is so important to help then inform specific projects. Because we already have this kind of landscape scale decision making, and we're really thinking at a country level or a province level. And the reason is there's a potential to integrate changes in natural capital into investment decisions to avoid the damage, rather than coming in Act 4 of a project that's already been decided, that's already been signed off, that's already started, and we're limited to mitigation measures to try to band-aid some of the damage. So if we have this information about the value of changes in natural capital, we can inform these decisions at a planning level, at an investment level, at a procurement level in order to justify investments in avoidance or in order to justify mitigation of damages after we've already thought about avoidance. And so often there is such potential for avoidance, but the conversations don't happen at the right time and the data doesn't come in at the right time. And the last point I want to mention is it's so important that the burden of proof of benefits of investment should not just be on conservation and environment. The burden of proof should also be on development. So all of these efforts need to, natural capital accounting and integrating the environment, need to be complemented by an insistence, I would say, on rigorous analysis and justification of the economic value of development projects. And we've been working on this for 25 years. And I can't tell you the number of times we've looked at an infrastructure project and there's actually no economic analysis showing that the net benefits are positive. It's just assumed. And many infrastructure projects generate more costs and benefits for society, even before environmental impacts are considered. So that's really important. If something's being proposed, what are the development goals? What are the development benefits? Who's getting them? Is there a better way to reach that goal? So I think that should also be in all of our minds at the same time. And then finally, just to leave you with the thought, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. I think we have so much opportunity to reach our development goals in better ways, and processes and systems like natural capital accounting, I think, can really help us get there. So thank you so much, and hopefully I didn't go over too much, Mark, and I really look forward to hearing questions, comments, experiences from all of our audience.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you very much for that. It's great to be able to actually look at the application and look at some specific case studies there. And I think your final point there about it's almost a mindset thing. So a lot of times we do just look at physical infrastructure or physical capital in a totally different light than we look at natural capital. And as you say, part of that, it's an insistence that when any capital needs to be developed, any infrastructure needs to be developed, that we actually look at that from an economic perspective and what are the implications thereof. And I think part of that then is a communication thing from our side, is how do we really build that awareness and communicate it so that it is effectively implemented and adopted. But yeah, really great to get those examples. So Ronald, I see he's struggled with his connection and was trying on his phone, but it's not looking likely. But the one thing, Kim, that I know Ronald did want to talk about, and sort of not going into the Ugandan specific example now, but one of the things that he wanted to raise was around capacity. How do we build capacity in country? And not just capacity from an individual perspective, but how do we make sure it's really entrenched and sort of institutionalized? So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Sorry to keep you talking after you needed a break.
That's okay. I got some water. I'm good.
And David, feel free to chip in as well after Kim, if you have any comments.
Yeah, it's such a great question, and I think our organization was founded actually on the conviction that filling that gap in the capacity of people working on sustainable development and particularly environment and conservation, that kind of capacity gap in terms of economics and finance is absolutely critical to really achieving the sustainable development goals, the conservation goals that we have. And it's really been incredible for me to see over this time period that I've been engaged in this work, kind of the evolution of institutions and people working in this field. I think when we first started, there'd be very few people coming through our training programs, for example, who had any economics background or finance background. It's almost all natural scientists. And now it's much more diverse. There's a much more diversity of disciplines, which is absolutely critical. The working in conservation, working in the environment, because we're not managing the environment, we're managing people. And so we have to have an understanding of people, We need the social sciences. We need social scientists, anthropologists, the economists, all of those. So there's that individual, the individual kind of human capacity building, I think, is really important. But there's also the institutional capacity building. And this is something that Ronald emphasized when he spoke on a panel that we had in our training in Nairobi, that it's really important to build capacity of individuals, but also of institutions, to really institutionalize this into their processes, into their systems, into their guidelines. And he shared how much and how successful that's been in Uganda, for example, that they've really been able to institutionalize and train their staff so that there is this institutional knowledge and institutional memory. And that is so important so that we have people in country with this technical capacity and institutions where that won't disappear if those people leave. And I think that's really important because people leave. It's a very fluid market, and people leave organizations and they move around. So building that institutional capacity is really important. And there's different ways to do that, but it takes a commitment from very high levels. And I think when Ronald was sharing what's happening in Uganda, for example, he was very, very proud to share that the analyses done to build these accounts were done by Ugandans. They got the training, they were able to do the analyses, they learned the software, they have that capacity now, and it doesn't require someone kind of parachuting in, parachuting out. And so I think that's so critical for that lasting capacity to be in country. And so that's something that I can't emphasize enough. I think that's what I've dedicated my career to doing, to really building that capacity. But I think it needs to be at institutional, human, individual levels, institutional levels, and also network levels. Like this community of practice is an example of building the capacity of networks. And those connections, I think, is also absolutely critical.
Yeah, I would.
Sorry, David,
I was just going
to
jump in. Yeah, all excellent points. I would also say that the building capacity doesn't necessarily have to end at either the institutional or policy level. CSF has built capacity down to the people that are absolutely directly impacted by climate change. People in agriculture, the farmers themselves, the fisher people. Sorry, that's load shedding, but hopefully the internet still works. So I think one of the biggest struggles in environmental policy is getting buy-in from the public. And the more buy-in you get from the public, the better chance. I mean, all this stuff looks fantastic on paper. We can preach all we want about, return on equity, return on investment, net present value, but unless and until it's made comprehensible to those, in the ballot box, essentially, we're still going to continue to struggle. A lot of this data, is presented, it's provided by people on the ground, people whose very livelihoods depend on these environmental ecosystem services. So I think I'm taking nothing away from the building capacity at the institutional level and everyone on this webinar, but I think actually you would find that the more you bring in people at the local level and all the way down to that primary source, the more successful all this stuff is going to be.
Yeah, no, good input, David. And I think that's sort of also sort of firmed up by one of the comments in the chats is how do we support students that are working in this space to conduct research using valuation tools. And I think this is the opportunity of a network, this community of practice, but then also sort of structured training programs where we can work with students, work with people in the field to actually help and carry out these and build that capacity. And that can be at multiple levels.
Can I just make one more? I was just going to make one more comment, sorry, which I hope is going to be helpful. Oh, good, the light came on. Maybe that's a sign. We get a lot of people coming through our trainings. Mark, you remember doing the international course. And at the end of our CSF trainings, we get a lot of people who basically say, okay, one of the things I learned from this training is I need to go back and get an environmental economics degree, or I now need to get a PhD. And I'm going to push back against that, I suppose. If you're going to support your students, supporting your students doesn't necessarily mean that they need to get a BA in economics and an MBA and then a PhD in environmental economics. I think, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but I think we could get, universal support for the fact that the public's knowledge of basic economics is about like that, right? Which means it's not going to take you much or your students much to have that comparative advantage. I wish it were higher, but it's not. So I actually think that building that capacity, especially starting with the students, start from where their passion is. They can be a social scientist. They could be a natural scientist and become an environmentalist. They could, they could be interested in anthropology. There are an enormous amount of cultural impacts that Kim and I have talked about and experienced at many other countries, that we've worked in, for whom the idea of the ownership of nature or valuing a natural asset is pure anathema to the culture, right? So I think there are so many different approaches that are necessary, but I guess my big take on this is I would start small. I don't think, I think, to use the jargon, the return on investment of basic economics knowledge is quite high. And then I think it hits diminishing returns pretty quickly. But I'm all for supporting the students, absolutely. But I don't think that necessarily means that we need, 25,000 more people in an environmental economics master's program.
Perfect, David, thank you. And on that note, I see Ronald is just plugged in. Ronald, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Sorry.
Wonderful.
I had challenges in joining.
No, it was perfect. It's called a photo finish. You're right at the end there. So really grateful that you were able to join us, and yeah, you're just in time. We've just gone through the presentations from David and from Kim, and Kim's run through a couple of case studies. We also spoke to some of the capacity building sort of opportunities and challenges, but maybe Ronald, I'll hand sort of straight over to you. But before I do, let me just give everyone a brief introduction to who you are, because you're now quite famous because we've been speaking about you for a while. But great to have you with us. So for those who don't know Ronald, he's the head of department, production, trade and tourism planning at the National Planning Authority in Uganda. He has worked previously as the acting director for policy planning, information and principal environment economist at the National Environmental Management Authority in Uganda. And he's been involved and coordinated a number of the development and strategic development plans within Uganda, part of the Green Growth Development Strategy, as well as agricultural and natural resource-based strategic plans, and of the National Development Plan for Uganda. So really bringing a lot of experience from the country level, from the government level, in the implementation of NCA and the development of NCA within Uganda. And really, Ronald, it would be great to understand your experience so far, not necessarily in terms of developing natural capital accounts, but how has that sort of helped and guided sort of decision-making and policy-making in Uganda? Over to you, Ronald. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My apologies for late joining in. I hope you have my slides.
Yeah, I can see them perfectly, and you are sharing, presenting.
Yes, in terms of experiences, first of all, I wish to say that natural capital accounting should be policy and demand driven. Specifically, it responds to key policy questions and challenges, but also tap into opportunities. In Uganda, we have the pressure today of degazettement of protected areas, forest reserves, especially in the urban areas, as well as game reserves for other competing land uses. It is a tool that can support lobbying and advocacy for budget allocation and especially prioritization development programs. And sometimes we need to compensate people who have lost, compensate lost biodiversity. When I'm developing a dam, a hydropower dam, there was a lot of biodiversity lost. So biodiversity offsets can be informed by natural capital accounting. We are building a standard gauge railway, which is passing through forest ecosystems, many roads. So again, natural capital accounting can inform all these. Now I've got a challenge also of getting the appropriate tariffs, fines, fees, and charges for the use of ecosystems. Again, natural capital accounting can inform all these. How much do we charge for entry in a national park? How do we charge if you knock an animal, for example? Some roads pass through national parks. I think these also can be informed by natural capital accounting. At the macro level, natural capital accounting informs planning and policy questions. For example, Uganda wants to achieve sustainable industrialization and socio-economic transformation. Industrialization will rely on natural capital. It is natural capital-based industrialization. We need to look at unemployment question. How does natural capital help us to answer unemployment questions that are facing the country? Poverty reduction, climate resilience growth, food security, energy security, water security, and resource use efficiency. All these we can get answers to them through natural capital. For example, many of our people depend on natural capital. Therefore, any investment in natural capital reduces unemployment, reduces poverty, and we need climate resilient growth. And this can be brought to the attention of policymakers, issues of food security, energy security, all these. Now, we used natural capital accounting to prepare the country health report. The World Bank has supported us to prepare the wealth report and the adjusted macroeconomic indicators. And the data, was generated, and most of the parameters that were used were actually natural capital accounting, parameters. And this informs annual work plans and budgets. The provision of data for expanded SAM, social accounting matrix, which is necessary for economic analysis, macroeconomic modeling, and forecasting. We want to integrate environmental and climate issues in our macroeconomic models. And again, the data can be provided by natural capital accounting. Now, country plans and budgets emphasize public-private investments. So we can see, again, natural capital accounting can guide investments in natural capital-related business. So again, it is very important in channeling public capital and private capital in investment. When we are doing the National Development Plan 3, and I want to say that we are moving on to NDP 4, the process has begun. A full program was dedicated to environment, to natural resources, environment, climate change, land and water management, and this benefited from natural capital accounting. So this program benefits natural capital accounting, but also it benefited from natural capital accounting. We have monitoring and evaluation indicators, which measure whether we are on a sustainable development path. We monitor forest and wetland covers. There are targets that have been set. For example, by 2040, 24% of Uganda's land cover should be covered by forest, and 13% should be covered by wetlands. These are sustainability indicators, which are monitored after every 5 years. And again, natural capital accounting can help us to monitor how we are doing in this area. So it informs these indicators and supports our reporting processes. Another experience that we've gained is that we need to forge partnerships at national, regional, and international levels. No institution can do natural accounting alone. So in Uganda, we have forged partnerships with the government ministries, departments, and agencies, such as the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, the National Planning Authority, Ministry of Water and Environment, NFA, the academia, among others. This enables us to tap into their specialities, into their institutional mandates, but also serve as key entry points. We also learned in the course of establishing natural capital accounting that it's important to involve non-natural resource-based sectors, such as the Ministry of Finance, National Planning Authority, because these create a link between NCA, macroeconomic policy, to planning and decision-making processes, to budgeting processes. So, and these serve as critical entry points. For example, during the national development plans, NPA has to have international partnerships. Uganda created partnerships with UNEP WCMC, with the World Bank WAVES program, with the Environment for Development, this is a Swedish supported program, with UNSD, with UNECA, among others. These are important for giving technical support, for peer learning, for financial support, and also for international exposure. I'll tell you that the World Bank took the Ugandan team to interface with Statistics Netherlands, learning from each other. They're also important for providing materials and also aligning data to the SIA framework. These are methodological issues which are a challenge, and therefore these international partnerships are critical in this area. I also wish to note here that if you are to win funding, you may need to submit a joint proposal. We did this with the UNEP WCMC, with the UK Darwin Initiative, where this proposal won us 355,000 pounds, which enabled us to do meta accounts. At the regional level, we have the Barone Declaration of Sustainability in Africa. Again, this creates opportunities for shared learning and support. And under this auspices, we have had many meetings within the African region. It's also important to institutionalize natural capital accounting for sustainability. We have institutions with specialized units and officers dedicated to natural capital accounts. The Uganda Bureau of Statistics has the satellite accounts unit with officers paid for by the government of Uganda and whose work is basically to produce natural capital accounts. The natural capital accounts needs also to be validated by UBOS, Uganda Bureau of Statistics, MDS, CSOs, the academia, and the international agencies for credibility. We have also learned that you need these partnerships for credibility. At the National Planning Authority, you have a senior planner and a planner, environment and natural resource, dedicated to environment and natural resource, including natural capital accounting. We've got the National Forest Authority, which has got a GIS unit, which produces most of the data indicating land use change, which supports natural capital accounting. It's also important to have technical studies. The National Forest Authority, for example, conducts the biomass study. The Ministry of Water conducts integrated water assessment. It also has wetland atlas, and the National Environmental Management Authority produces the State of the Environment reports after every 2 years. Now, these reports generate data, which is used in natural capital accounting. Of course, it is also important that these supporting sectors, their support to integrate natural capital in their plans, in their sector plans. NFA, Uganda Water Authority, and NEMA are supported to do that. If you are to sustain natural capital accounting, you need to build local capacity. I want to say proudly that Uganda is one of the few African countries that have built local capacity in natural capital accounting. And this has reduced over-reliance on foreign consultants. The local consultants know the local terrain, better. They know where to get what and what. And as a result, several natural capital accounts have been developed under different initiatives. For example, under the UNEP WCMC, we're able to produce the biodiversity extent account, the tourism accounts, fisheries accounts, and this land soil improvement accounts. With the World Bank partnership, we're able to produce the land forest ecosystem services accounts, wetlands and water accounts, and we're also supported by UNECA to produce the water accounts. Yes, we also, building the community of practice is also critical. We've got a plan which brings together at a national level a community of practice. And under this plan, we strengthen capacity to compile and use natural capital accounts through training workshops, which are organized by the government ministries, departments, and agencies, as well as civil society. And many times, the international development partners also support this capacity building. Through these partnerships, there is regular data collection, and these are used. Yes, this country-generated data and supportive studies, generate the data that we use. Partnerships have been created with the academia to deliver courses and presentation natural capital accounting. I've been privileged to participate in this delivery of academia courses at our universities, especially Makerere University under the College of Business Management. And this is our premier university. It is also important to have robust dissemination strategy. Therefore, we have developed policy briefs and policy papers. We have held breakfast meetings. And again, the relevant partners have been very supportive in these areas. It's important to have political commitment for the sustainable use of environment and natural resource policies, enforcement, support legal and institutional framework, as well as implementation. Yes, Uganda government is implementing the accounts recommendation, the key stakeholders, basically to support economic recovery after the COVID, pandemic. Recently, we are boosted by the presidential directives on tourism, where the president made directions and pronouncements on tourism. Of course, there were many interventions. I want also to add that the tourism accounts, again, made this very visible, and the president, came out to give a strategic direction on tourism, and we're very proud of that. Yes, I've mentioned that. In terms of challenges, I want to mention that NCA is a complex subject that is not clearly understood and appreciated. So we still have a challenge of ensuring that this is understood at all levels. Financing is a challenge, especially in view of the fiscal constraints facing the country. The government budget is becoming low. Of course, the global environment, the post-COVID-19, and the declining official development assistance is also a challenge in financing natural capital accounting. Integrating natural capital accounting into planning, policy, and decision-making is also a challenge. There are many things to integrate in planning, many cross-cutting issues. Many people want to integrate many issues in planning and policy. Therefore, to compete for that space is a challenge. There is also a challenge of data availability. This data is complex, requires expertise, requires financing. So these also make this process very, very difficult. Thank you for listening. I think that is all I wanted to say for God and my country.
Wonderful. Ronald, thank you. And it's so good to get that insight. And you make such an important point, sort of just something that I want to raise, in the challenges piece here, the importance of, well, how do we finance this work in the face of fiscal constraints or otherwise? And it sort of goes back to what Kim mentioned earlier about often other infrastructure projects or other sectors implementing certain things do not have to undertake economic assessments within their project space. So putting in a road, for example, doesn't necessarily need to, as part of their responsibilities, undertake an economic assessment and understand or put in sort of view what negative implications or impacts are in terms of the natural capital that they might be degrading or eroding. And so it is something that we do need to look at rebalancing there, and that's part of that is really sort of getting it understood by the public and getting it much more broadly and widely understood. But then also you talk about political will, and you say in Uganda there has been such strong sort of support from the government for that. And Ronald, I just wanted to ask you a quick question in terms of getting that political will within Uganda. What are some of the sort of the challenges that you've faced in getting that, or how have you achieved that political will? How has Uganda sort of really taken the sort of lead in this space?
Okay, thank you. You need to understand the political dynamics in the country. You need to understand the political economy of the country and link natural capital accounting with the political economy of the country. How does natural capital accounting affect security? Security is a key concern of government. And when there is water insecurity, food insecurity, energy insecurity, it affects national security. So natural capital accounting is a key input to national security. That is one. So you need to look at the macroeconomic development objectives. Government wants to create jobs, reduce poverty, raise exchange for foreign exchange earnings. So you link natural capital accounting to these critical macroeconomic goals of the country. That will give you a critical entry point into the political goals of the country, and therefore you obtain political will and commitment to this. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. So it's really around being relevant to the national agenda, items of a country, the national objectives, and really sort of understanding that local context and understanding the local political economy that you're operating in within that country. That's great. I see there were a number of questions that were in the chat box, and they have been answered directly there. So thanks very much to Kim and David for going ahead and answering all of those. I see we are coming up to the end of the webinar. And so I think with all those questions having been answered there, I think it is, are there any sort of final questions that anyone is itching to ask before I hand it over to Peter to wrap us up? Or any final comments from our panelists?
I have one final thing I want to mention, just following on what Ronald was saying. In order to really try to generate some of that political will or public support, I think also in the past, conservation or environmental objectives have had sort of a public relations problem or a branding issue. And so really framing it, like Ronald was saying, conservation is not a luxury problem. This is critical to our well-being, to our security, to economic goals. And I hope there's a day that comes where it will no longer seem like when we talk about roads, we talk about investment in roads, but when we talk about conservation, we talk about costs. They're all costs, they're all investments. It's the same thing. You invest in protected areas, you invest in conservation, you invest in development. They're all investments where there are costs up front for benefits you think you'll get later. And I hope to see those all in the same terms rather than conservation being framed as sacrifice and foregoing development. So I think we need to shift how we talk about these things and talk about them in ways that I think will resonate much better.
Yeah, good. I would totally agree. I think the whole what's interesting is if you talk to anyone who's starting a small business, you get capital up front to invest, knowing that you may not even see revenues or profits for 5 or 10 years. So why is that? Just to pick an example, Amazon lost billions of dollars in the first 10 years, and now it's one of the most profitable companies on planet Earth. So if we can do that in the private sector for goods and services that are not environmentally related, why can't we apply the same logic to environmental goods and services? And also to Ronald's point about macro, the environment itself, the environmental sector is a fantastic job creator. Why don't we ever talk about that in terms of job creation? So all the, shifting these resources and incentivizing work in the environmental sector creates value in and of itself, creates jobs, and helps the environment, in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks to both of you. And I think, we've come to the end of our time now, but I'd love to keep this discussion going. And my email address was on that invitation. So if anyone has further questions or thoughts or comments, please feel free to email through to me, and likewise via Peter as well. I know through this community of practice, it's really an opportunity to discuss and engage and to continue these discussions. So thanks to everybody for being here today, and specifically thanks very much to David, to Kim, to Ronald, for taking the time and just sharing with us some of your experiences and some of the ideas and thoughts that we can take on as we put this into practice. So thanks very much, and over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful chair and moderator, Mark. Thank you very much for keeping us engaged. I think I didn't blink at all. I was very much attentive. And I think this is the kind of webinar where we are learning so much within the shortest time possible. And I think the webinar was very relevant in terms of where we are, in terms of countries really taking on this very important work of bringing environment, natural resources, and climate change at the center of development. Because here we are talking about the nexus between development and protection of our nature, the biodiversity loss that we are facing, the critical social ills that are coming from neglecting nature in terms of management, where we are seeing now diseases coming from nature because of how we are interacting with nature and some of the challenges that we are having. And I liked Kim's presentation specifically on the area where she touched on integrating nature into natural capital into decision-making processes. And I think this is very critical. This is most of countries in Africa, for example, those who have made progress like South Africa, like Botswana, like Uganda, how do we transform this very important data and translate it into informing policies and decision-making and the national development plans of countries? Ronald brought it very, very clearly in terms of linking this nexus. And I think, Ronald, thank you so much for that. We always count on you, Ronald, my wonderful colleague from Uganda. Thank you so much for sharing this experience. And I think so many member countries are going to come to you to Uganda to learn from you. And we highly encourage the South-South exchange. Now we have the experts. We have Conservation Strategy Fund team ready to support you countries who are here. Please feel free to reach out to them, not only in terms of sharing this knowledge, but also even partnering and collaborating to come up with projects and proposals for you to be able even to access more resources to implement natural capital accounting within your respective countries. So we highly encourage this. We highly encourage these partnership and collaborations for countries to quickly a leapfrog, because if Rwanda, it took 5 years for Rwanda to do the account, it shouldn't take another country like Malawi, which is coming on board five years, because we have all the resources together. We have this platform, this community of practice to bring together different opportunities and examples and learn from other countries what they have done for us to leapfrog and do this work quickly and possibly. And I think one last point I want to make is that natural capital accounting, actually, if it is done well, it can actually help you in terms of responding to your obligations of reporting. Let it be on SDGs, let it be in terms of NDC Paris Agreement, let it be on NBSAPs, the biodiversity strategy frameworks and the implementation plan that you're doing. If you have a robust system of NCA in the countries, you would respond to all these obligations of national plan reporting and all that. So guys, we are ready as a community of practice to work with you, working with partner institutions like CSF and member states to do South-South learning, but also Kagwa Roland talked about their experience in Netherlands, even other development countries that have done a wonderful work like the UK government, the Netherlands. They are always ready if you work with the partner institutions and other member countries to seek for study tours and go and learn from them how they are doing this. So please reach out to the community of practice, reach out to your fellow member states, reach out to CSF so that we can advance this work and move quickly to save our planet and save our biodiversity. Thank you very much. And for this, I would like to thank you all participants for your engagement and interactive discussions. You've seen a lot of questions coming in, a lot of responses, and this is very much exciting. The recording is here. We will share the recording as soon as we finalize with the communication team. And the presentations, all the presentations, we'll put them together and we'll post it on the website. And actually, let's take this discussion to our webpage at the Community of Practice website and continue the discussions from there. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening and a nice morning to those who are still in the morning hours. All right. Thank you so much and have a nice day. Bye to you all.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Mark, Kim, Ronald, and David.
Thanks, everyone.
Leona.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Kim.
Yasmina.
Sure.
Thank you. I appreciate you all.
Bye.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Peter. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you, Kim. We really appreciated you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ronald. So glad you made
Thank you.
it.
And
Great one,
David
Kim.
went away. David is a wonderful person.
Great. All right,
Send
take
our
care.
regards, Kim. Send our regards to David.
Okay, I will. Absolutely. Absolutely. And would you like me to send a PDF version of my presentation? Would that be helpful?
Yes, and that of Leonard. I don't know who has that of Leonard. Yeah, if you could
I
share
have it.
both.
Okay, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Leona. Thank you. Okay, so have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you. You do the same, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Yasmina. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Glad it was a lot better this time.
It was really way better.
We worked out the kinks.
Great job. Yes. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.